The rain started before dawn on the last Wednesday of September, the kind of slow, indifferent Ohio rain that doesn't announce itself with thunder or wind, but simply arrives and stays soaking everything it touches with quiet, bureaucratic thoroughness. Ruth Calloway stood at the kitchen window at 6 in the morning with a cup of coffee she had stopped tasting and watched it fall on the garden she had spent 23 years building from a patch of clay soil and stubbornness into something the neighbors on Briarwood Lane slowed their cars to look at in June. The dahlias were still blooming. It was the last week of September, and they were still blooming because she had tended them since the third year in this house when she had learned their particular requirements, the depth they needed, the drainage, the way they rewarded attention with a generosity that most living things reserved. They did not know it was the last morning. They bloomed the way they always bloomed, without asking permission, without requiring an audience. Ruth set the coffee cup on the counter. She had been in this kitchen since 1976. 47 years of mornings at this window, 47 years of the particular way the light came through the glass in October and fell on the floor in a rectangle that moved west as the morning aged. She knew the sound of every drawer. She knew the way the faucet needed a quarter turn past what seemed sufficient, or it would drip through the night. She knew the scuff on the baseboard where the refrigerator door had swung open too hard in 1989 when Diane was 11 and had never been repaired because George had said he would get to it, and then life had continued, and the scuff had become part of the house the way all the small marks of a life lived in one place become part of it, indistinguishable eventually from the house itself. George had built the cabinets. He had built them in the winter of 1978, 2 years after they moved in, when he had enough money saved from the restoration work he had been doing on a downtown office building to buy the lumber he wanted. He had wanted white oak. He had driven to a sawmill in Indiana to get it. Ruth had thought at the time that this was excessive, that the cabinets in the rental they had lived in before were perfectly adequate, and that white oak from Indiana was a luxury they did not need. She had said as much. George had listened to her with the expression he wore when he was considering what she said, and had already decided, and then he had driven to Indiana anyway. She had been right that they did not need it. She had been wrong about what that meant. 45 years later, the cabinets looked the way they had looked when he finished them, because white oak from a good mill does not age the way lesser wood ages. They had outlasted the refrigerator twice. They had outlasted the flooring which she had replaced in 1997. They had outlasted, she now understood the claim she had believed she held on this house. The moving truck had come and gone the day before. The furniture that was going to Diane's garage in Cincinnati had gone. The boxes in storage had gone. What remained in the house this morning was what she was taking in the taxi, 2 suitcases and the portrait from the bedroom dresser, and what she was leaving behind, which was everything else, including the cabinets George had driven to Indiana, for which were attached to the walls of a house that now belonged to a bank in Columbus, that had sent her a letter in August, written in language so precise and neutral it had taken her 3 readings to fully understand that it was telling her she had to leave. She had signed the papers. She remembered signing them. She did not remember what they said. This was the thing she had returned to again and again in the weeks since the letter arrived. She had been sitting across from George at the same kitchen table in the spring of 2018 during the second round of chemotherapy, and he had set a stack of papers in front of her, medical authorizations and insurance forms, and things she did not have the capacity to read carefully because she was managing his care and her fear at the same time, and the two together left very little room for anything else. She had signed what he put in front of her. She had trusted him. She had trusted him for 41 years at that point, and trust had become so habitual it no longer felt like a choice. It was simply how she moved through the world. She trusted George the way she trusted the ground to be there when she took a step. The letter from the bank had explained the rest. A reverse mortgage executed in April of 2018 using the equity in the house on Briarwood Lane as collateral. The loan had funded the treatments that the insurance had covered partially, and they had covered the rest of, and the rest of had been significant, And now the loan was due, and the house would transfer to the bank's ownership on a date that had now arrived. She had called Diane. Diane had come down and they had sat at this table and gone through everything twice and called a housing counselor whose name was on a card the bank's letter had included. The counselor had been thorough and kind. She had confirmed what the letter said. There was no way out that Ruth had not already found and found closed. She had not been angry at first. That surprised her in the weeks after the letter arrived. She had felt something she could not name precisely, something that sat at the intersection of grief and bewilderment in a kind of hollow recognition, as though some part of her had always known the ground was not entirely solid and had simply not examined it closely enough to confirm. George had taken out a loan against the house to pay for the treatments that kept him alive. He had done it without telling her because he knew her and he knew what she would have said, and he had made a decision alone that the treatments mattered more than the house. He had decided on her behalf. He had decided without asking. Then the anger had come slower than she expected and heavier. Not the hot anger of an immediate betrayal, but the cold, specific anger of someone who has understood something precisely. He had known her well enough to know she would sign without reading. He had used that knowledge. He had used 41 years of her trust as the instrument of a decision she had no say in making. She had spent the months since trying to hold both things at once. The man who had driven to Indiana for White Oak because he wanted to build her something that would last. The man who had signed papers that would take the house without telling her. The same hands that had fitted those cabinet doors with such precision that they still hung perfectly level after 45 years had also set a stack of papers in front of her and waited while she signed away the house she had lived in for most of her adult life. She could not resolve it. She had stopped trying to resolve it and had started simply carrying it the way you carry things that do not have a resolution, not in front of you where you have to look at them, but present nonetheless a weight you have learned the shape of. The taxi was coming at 9. It was now 6:45. Ruth picked up the portrait from the kitchen table where she had moved it the morning after George died, so she could see it from her chair during the mornings. It was not a large photograph. A framed picture from their 25th anniversary in 2001, George in the dark suit he had owned since their wedding, and worn 4 times since looking at the camera, with the expression of a man who is enduring being photographed with patience and mild impatience simultaneously. She had always loved this expression. It was one of the most George things about him, the way he could contain 2 contradictory states without appearing to notice the contradiction. She carried it to the front room and set it with the suitcases. Then she went back to the kitchen and did what she had been doing every morning for 47 years. She washed the coffee cup and set it in the rack to dry and wiped the counter down and stood for a moment looking at the white oak cabinets. Then she walked out the back door without looking at the garden. The taxi driver did not try to make conversation, which Ruth appreciated. She sat in the back seat with the portrait in her lap and watched Briarwood Lane disappear in the rain behind them, and said nothing and felt nothing she could have put into words, which was perhaps the only mercy the morning had to offer. The Millfield Inn was 8 blocks from the house on Briarwood Lane, close enough that she could, if she had wanted, to walk back and stand on the sidewalk and look at the dahlias still blooming in the garden. She did not want to, but she had chosen the Millfield because it was within her budget for the week she needed, while the arrangements with Diane were finalized, and there had been something in the closeness that had felt when she made the reservation, like not having entirely left yet, like a pause rather than an ending. It was the kind of motel that had been built in the 1970s and had not changed significantly since, which gave it the quality of something functional and nothing more. Clean in the way of places that are cleaned regularly without being cared for. Room 12 was at the end of the ground floor hallway, a bed with a green coverlet that matched nothing else in the room, a table with 2 chairs, a window that looked at the parking lot. Ruth set the suitcases in the corner. She set the portrait on the table. She sat on the edge of the bed. The movement of the day had been a kind of protection, filling the hours with tasks that required attention and left no space for the things she was carrying underneath. The taxi, the check-in, the young woman at the front desk who had been professionally cheerful in the way of people performing a service, and Ruth had returned the smile and it had cost her something. Now the movement had stopped. The room was quiet. The space had appeared and the thing she had been carrying was fully present without the buffer of tasks between her and it. She had been a widow for 7 months. She was now also a woman without the house where she had been a wife and a mother and a neighbor and a gardener and everything else she had been for 47 years. She had lost George in February. She had lost the house in September. The two losses were different in nature but had arrived close enough together that they had the quality of a single event, the second landing before she had absorbed the first. She thought about George. She thought about the reverse mortgage and what it had required him to do, which was to manage the facts of their situation alone, to make a decision that affected them both without consultation, to look at his wife sitting across from him at the kitchen table and calculate that she would sign what he put in front of her because she trusted him. He had been right, she had, and she did not know even now whether what he had done was an act of love or an act of taking. She suspected it was both. She had come to believe that in long marriages, love and taking were sometimes the same gesture made with the same hands for reasons that were true and insufficient simultaneously. She reached across the table for the portrait. She needed to see his face. Not the memory of his face, which had begun in these 7 months to do the thing memories do, to shift and soften to become a composite rather than a specific, but the actual photograph. The grain of it, the particular angle of light on his face in that moment. In 2001, when he was looking at the camera with patience and mild impatience, and she had been standing just to the left of the photographer, and he had glanced at her once in a way she had caught, and that had told her everything about what this day meant to him without a single word in it. She picked it up. Her hands were tired in the way hands are tired at the end of a day that has asked more of them than they had easily available. She held the portrait, and then it slipped. She could not catch it. It hit the edge of the table and fell, and the glass shattered and the frame came apart in the way of things held together by simple mechanisms that separate on impact. Ruth knelt on the floor of room 12 to pick up the pieces. The photograph itself was undamaged. It had fallen face up clear of the broken glass. She picked it up carefully, and then she stopped. The frame had come entirely apart in the fall, and she could see now that the back of it was not what she had thought it was. She had owned this frame for 22 years and had never looked at the back with any attention. Why would she? It was the back of a frame, but what she saw now was not the simple backing she expected. There was a secondary panel, a thin piece of wood fitted behind the main backing with such precision that it was invisible when the frame was intact, the edges flush, no gap, no visible seam. The kind of work that required not just skill, but intention. The kind of hidden compartment that a carpenter would know how to build into a frame, that no one else would think to look for. The fall had separated the panel from the frame. Behind it, folded carefully, was a document, and resting against the document, attached by a loop of old string to a small eyelet on the panel itself, was a key. A plain old-fashioned key, the kind made before keys became electronic and disposable. And attached to the key was a small piece of shell from Lake Erie white, and smooth, the kind you find on the island beaches, and put in your pocket because it catches your eye and seems worth keeping. Ruth sat on the floor of room 12 and unfolded the document with hands that had stopped being tired. It was a property deed. She recognized the form. She and George had dealt with deeds before when they bought the house on Briarwood Lane in 1976, and she knew what she was looking at within the first few lines. A deed of ownership for a parcel of land and the structure upon it located on Dune Ridge Road, Kelly's Island, Ohio, dated 1987 in the name of George Arthur Calloway. She read it 3 times. Then she found the letter. It had been folded inside the deed, a single sheet of paper in George's handwriting, the careful, slightly angular handwriting of a man who had taught himself to write neatly because his work required precision in every form it took. She had seen this handwriting on the notes he left on the kitchen counter when he went out early. She had seen it on the birthday cards he gave her every year, which were always short and always said exactly what they needed to say. She had kept every one of them in a box that now sat in a storage unit in Dayton. The letter was not long. George had never been long when he could be brief. He had written that he bought the land on Kelly's Island in 1987 with money saved from a preservation contract, a commission to restore a historic office building in downtown Dayton that had paid well for his particular skills with old wood. The property had been inexpensive. Kelly's Island was quiet in those years, a small place on Lake Erie that people passed through in summer and that sat largely empty the rest of the year. He had stood on the ridge above the lake on the day he looked at the land and had thought as he wrote it simply someday. He had worked on the cabin over the years he wrote. Weekends when he told her he had jobs out of town. He had used wood he saved from demolitions, old growth timber, from buildings being torn down across Ohio wood that was no longer made in the quality it had once been. He had recognized this wood for what it was and could not watch it be destroyed. He had brought it to the island piece by piece over the years and used it to build and restore the small cabin on the property, working slowly and carefully. He had never told her because he wanted it to be a surprise, a retirement surprise, the best one he could think of. He was sorry he was leaving before he could give it to her in person, but it was hers. It had always been hers. He had built it for her. At the bottom of the letter he had written, "The key fits the front door. There is a mat on the porch I put there in 2018. It says home. I hope you'll go see it. I think you'll understand when you get there." Ruth sat on the floor of room 12 and held the letter and the deed in the key with the Lake Erie shell, and she did not move for a long time. The anger she had been carrying, the cold, specific anger about the reverse mortgage, did not disappear. But something had shifted around it, the way a room shifts when you open a window. The same room, the same dimensions, but the air moving differently. She had believed she understood the shape of George's betrayal. She had not known that the same man in the same period of his life had also been doing this, had been driving to an island on the weekends of the years he was sick and building her a door to walk through after everything else was gone. She could not be grateful without also being angry. She could not be angry without also being grateful. She could not think about the reverse mortgage without thinking about the deed. She could not think about the deed without thinking about the reverse mortgage. The two things were made by the same hands, and she would spend the rest of her life not fully knowing how they fit together in his mind, because the person who could have explained it was gone. She got up from the floor. She washed her face at the sink. She sat at the small hotel and unfolded the deed again and found on her phone the address. She found photographs of Kelly's Island. The lake in late summer, blue and wide, the limestone ridges, the quiet roads, the particular quality of Great Lakes light on water softer than ocean light, more interior, the light of a body of water that is contained by land and knows it. She found the ferry schedule from Marblehead to the island. 20 minutes on the water, she held the key with the shell. George had stood on that ridge in 1987 when he was 38 years old, and she was 36, and they had been married 11 years and had a daughter in middle school. In a house on Briarwood Lane, they were still paying off in a future that was present in front of them, the way futures are present when you are young enough to believe in them without examination. He had stood there and looked at the lake and thought someday. He had spent 32 years turning someday into a deed and a key and a mat that said home. She was going to go see it. She opened the ferry schedule again and looked at the times. She opened the small notepad from the motel desk and picked up the pen and began to write things down. She had navigated every ordinary crisis. A long life in one place accumulates the roof in 2004. The car in 2009, the winter George had been laid off for 3 months, and they had lived on savings and her part-time work at the library and had not mentioned it to anyone because it was theirs to manage. She knew how to make a plan. She wrote down what she needed. She wrote down what she had. She wrote down the questions she could not yet answer and left space beside them. The bus from Dayton to Marblehead left at 6:15 in the morning. The ferry ran every 2 hours in September. The deed had a parcel number. She would need to confirm the title was clear. She needed to see the cabin before she could know anything else. Outside the window of room 12, the parking lot of the Millfield Inn was wet and quiet in the Dayton rain. 8 blocks away, the house on Briarwood Lane sat with its new locks on the old doors, the dahlias still blooming in the garden in the rain. The white oak cabinets George had driven to Indiana for were still in the kitchen. She could not have any of that back. But she was holding a key with a piece of Lake Erie shell, and there was a mat on a porch on an island she had never been to that said home, and George had put it there in 2018 when he was already sick, when he already knew the shape of what was coming, and he had driven to that island anyway and placed that mat there for her, for the version of her that would arrive after everything else had been taken. She thought about what that meant. She thought about what kind of love works on a 32-year timeline that plans for the future of the person it loves beyond its own ability to be present for that future. She did not have a word for it. She turned off the light at 10 o'clock. She lay in the dark of room 12 and held the key with the shell against her palm and thought about George at 38 years old standing on a ridge above Lake Erie looking at the water thinking someday. She thought you always saw things before other people saw them. She thought I did not know the half of you. She thought I am going to find out. The ferry from Marblehead left at 9 in the morning and Ruth was on it. She had taken the 6:15 bus from Dayton, 3 hours on a coach that moved through the flat Ohio countryside in the particular gray light of early October. The fields stripped down after harvest, the trees beginning their slow turn toward color. The sky the color of old pewter, pressing low over everything. She had her 2 suitcases in the luggage compartment below, and the portrait wrapped in a sweater in her carry bag, and the deed in the inside pocket of her coat, and the key with the shell in her right hand, where her fingers could find it without thinking. She had not told Diane where she was going. Not yet. She had sent a message the night before saying she was well and would call in a few days. She needed to see the cabin before she described it to anyone. She needed to know what she was dealing with before she asked anyone else to have feelings about it. The ferry was a flat-bottomed boat that held perhaps 40 passengers and 2 vehicles, and at this hour in early October, it held Ruth, a man with a bicycle, and a couple in their 50s with matching rain jackets, who spent the crossing pointing at things on the water and consulting a map. The lake was gray-blue and flat, the island visible ahead as a low, dark line against the paler sky. 20 minutes. The distance felt standing at the ferry railing with the wind off the lake and the key in her hand, like the distance between one life and whatever came next. The cab from the island's small dock knew Dune Ridge Road without needing the full address. That whole stretch has been changing, the driver said. New builds going up every couple of years. Good land up there. Ruth said nothing. She watched the island pass outside the window. The October maples, the limestone outcroppings, the glimpses of the lake between the trees. She thought about George driving here on a September weekend in 1987 with enough money saved from the Dayton restoration job to buy a piece of land nobody was paying much attention to yet. She thought about what it meant to see value in something before anyone else was looking. The cab turned onto Dune Ridge Road, and she understood immediately why he had chosen it. The road ran along the top of a limestone ridge above the lake, and the view from that ridge was the view that made people drive an hour from the mainland for an afternoon. The lake wide and gray-blue in the October light, the far Canadian shore just visible at the horizon, the particular quality of Great Lakes water that holds light differently than ocean water, more contained, more intimate, as though the water knows it is surrounded. The properties on either side of the road were new or newly renovated, the confident architecture of significant investment. And then between two of them, set slightly back from the road on a lot where the native vegetation had been allowed to grow as it chose, was the cabin. It was small, dark wood weathered to the particular silver gray of old timber that has been maintained but not over-maintained. A covered front porch, shuttered windows, a front path made of flat limestone pieces pressed into the ground. The vegetation around the cabin was high and wild, the native grasses and late-season wildflowers of the Lake Erie shore, and the effect was not of neglect, but of belonging. The cabin did not look like something imposed on the landscape. It looked like something the landscape had grown around. On the front porch, clearly visible from the road, was a mat. She paid the driver. She picked up her bags. She walked up the limestone path through the tall grass and stepped onto the porch and looked down. Home. She put the key in the lock. It turned as smoothly as a key turns in a lock that has been recently maintained. He had oiled it on his last visit. Of course he had. She pushed the door open. The smell reached her before anything else. Wood and lake air and the particular dryness of a space that has been kept clean and carefully closed, and underneath all of that, something she could not name except by its effect, which was that she felt standing in the doorway of a place she had never been, that she had been here before. She stepped inside. The main room was not large. A sitting area, a small kitchen, along one wall, a table with 2 chairs, windows on the lakeside. But it was not the size of the room that stopped her. It was the floor. She recognized it. The boards were laid in the pattern she had seen every day for 47 years in the house on Briarwood Lane, a varying width pattern that created a rhythm across the surface, wide boards alternating with narrow ones in a sequence that was not random, but was not quite regular either. George had laid the floor in the Briarwood kitchen in 1981, and she had watched him do it and had asked why he didn't just use uniform boards, and he had said without looking up from his work, because that's not how good wood wants to lie. The same pattern. Here, on an island she had never visited, he had replicated it deliberately. He had thought about what home felt like to her, the specific sensory details of the place where she was most herself, and he had carried those details here and built them in so that when she finally arrived, she would recognize it before she understood why. Ruth set her bags down and stood in the middle of the room and breathed. She walked slowly through each space, touching the surfaces, the way you touch things you are trying to read. The kitchen cabinet hardware was cast iron old, the kind that came from a house of a certain age. She recognized the style. She had seen George bring pieces like this home once and set them on the workshop shelf. Now she understood. The window frames were fitted with the precision that had been his particular standard. No gap, no settling the wood, doing exactly what it was asked to do. The shelves along the back wall had the same joinery she had seen in the bookshelves he built for the Briarwood living room. She found the bedroom. A bed frame in dark wood, handmade, the proportions right in the way handmade things are right when the maker has thought about the person who will use them. She found a closet with a wooden box on the shelf, a small thing with a fitted lid. She left the box for now. She went to the back of the cabin and opened the rear door. The porch ran the full width of the back of the cabin and faced the ridge and the lake beyond it. The view from here was the view she had seen in the photograph, but the photograph had not prepared her for the scale of it, the way the lake filled the lower half of the visible world all the way to the horizon, or for the light on it in this October morning, the way the low autumn sun came in at an angle and turned the surface into something that seemed designed to be beautiful rather than simply being beautiful by accident. George had known about this view for 36 years. On the porch were 2 rocking chairs, handmade dark wood the same as the bed frame. She ran her hand along the arm of the one nearest to her and felt the surface plain smooth in the way that required patience and the willingness to do something until it was right rather than until it was done. 2 chairs. He had made 2. He had placed them side by side facing the lake, which meant that in his mind, even in the years before he told her about this place, she had already been here sitting beside him, looking at the water. She sat in the chair nearest the door. She looked at the lake. She stayed there for a long time. His name was Everett Marsh, and he appeared at the base of the limestone path the following morning at 7:30. Ruth came around the side of the cabin from the back porch with their coffee and found him standing at the edge of the road looking at the front of the structure with the focused attention of a person who is not seeing a building but reading one. He was perhaps 65, lean, with the weathered outdoor quality of someone who has spent decades in the field rather than at a desk. He wore a canvas jacket with a worn collar and carried a notebook rather than a phone. He apologized immediately. He had been walking Dune Ridge Road every morning for the past week. He had noticed the cabin as he always noticed it on his visits to the island, but this morning the shutters were back and he had stopped without thinking. He was a preservation architect, he said. He worked with historic structures across the Great Lakes region. He had been coming to Kelly's Island for 30 years and had walked past this cabin many times and had always wondered about it. Ruth looked at him for a moment. She had spent 47 years reading people. "You know about old buildings," she said. It was not a question. She told him it was her property. She told him about the deed from 1987 and the wood her husband had salvaged from demolitions and the 32 years of weekends George had spent here. She watched his expression change as she talked, the professional attention sharpening into something more specific. He asked if he could look more closely. She said yes. He spent 2.5 hours inside. Ruth made tea and sat on the back porch and listened to him moving through the rooms, stopping moving again. When he came out, he sat in a second rocking chair and was quiet for a moment before he spoke. "Your husband was an extraordinary craftsman," he said. "I don't use that word carelessly." Ruth looked at the lake. She said. He explained what she was looking at. The primary structural wood was American chestnut. The American chestnut had once been one of the dominant trees of the eastern forests, billions of trees from Maine to Georgia, a species so prevalent that entire regional economies had been built around it. Then at the turn of the 20th century, a fungal blight arrived and moved through the American forests with a completeness that was one of the great ecological catastrophes in recorded American history. Within 50 years, virtually every American chestnut in the country was dead. The species had not been commercially available since the early 1900s. The wood in this cabin, he said, the main structural beams, the framing, the shelving, the floor came from buildings constructed before the blight. Buildings that had been demolished across Ohio over decades. George had recognized it and saved it, and he had used it here with joinery techniques that most contemporary carpenters no longer knew. Ruth held her tea and looked at the lake. He always saved things, she said. He couldn't watch good things be destroyed. There are preservation organizations that would consider this cabin significant, Everett said. And there are people, the kind who collect significant historic architecture, who would want to own something like this, not to alter it, to live in it exactly as it is because what's here cannot be made again. "A man named Fitch came to see me yesterday," Ruth said. Everett nodded. He knew the name. "Cole wants the land," he said, using the wrong name from habit before correcting himself. "Fitch wants the land. He would take this down in a week. What I'm describing is different. The value of this cabin is not the land under it. It's the cabin itself." He offered to write a formal architectural assessment of the structure and to put her in contact with a real estate attorney who specialized in historic properties. He said he would do both at no charge. When she asked him directly why, he looked at the chestnut wall beside him. "Because this matters," he said. "Because what your husband did deserved to be understood before it was lost." He stood to leave and paused, looking at the two rocking chairs. "He made both of them," Ruth said. He looked at the chairs the way he had looked at the walls reading them. "He made them for the view," he said. "He wanted someone to sit here and look at the water. He wanted us to sit here," Ruth said. "Both of us." After he left, she went inside and took the wooden box down from the closet shelf. It was a simple box with a fitted lid made from the same chestnut as the structural beams, which meant he had built it here from the material at hand. She lifted the lid. Inside was a stack of papers held together with a binder clip, and beneath the papers, a small notebook with a dark green cover. The papers were records. George's handwriting careful and specific. Each major piece of wood in the cabin was documented: the source building, the address, the year of demolition, the organization or contractor he had worked with to salvage the material. The records went back to 1989. 34 years of documentation, meticulous and complete, the records of a man who had been building something he intended to last and had known from the beginning that whoever came after would need to understand what it was. She set the records aside and opened the green notebook. It was not a journal in any conventional sense. George had not been a man who wrote about his feelings. What the notebook contained was the record of a craftsman, dates materials, techniques, measurements, notes on problems encountered and solutions found. But he had not kept it entirely to that language. She found the first departure on a page dated October of 2003. After a technical note about the framing of the back porch, he had written a single line in the same matter-of-fact hand. Ruth would like this view. I know because of the way she always turns toward water. She stopped reading. She looked at that sentence for a long time. Then she turned the pages slowly and she found them scattered through the years, these brief departures from the technical record. Not frequent, not sentimental in the way sentiment is usually expressed, but present in the way that George himself had always been present, quietly and specifically, and with the attention of someone who had been watching for a long time. November 2007. The kitchen cabinet doors hang level now. She notices when things are level. She notices when they're not, but doesn't always say so. March 2012 brought the hardware from the old post office on 3rd Street. She would have wanted to know where it came from. I'll tell her when I show her this place. September 2015. The floor is done. I use the same pattern as Briarwood. I want her to feel it before she sees it. February 2019. Last trip before the weather closes in. Sat on the porch for an hour. Thought about telling her. Decided to wait until spring. There's still work to do, and I want it to be right when she sees it. She closed the notebook. She sat at the kitchen table in the October light and felt the full weight of what she was holding. Not the loss of Briarwood, not the grief of losing George, but the specific weight of this, the knowledge that she had been loved for 47 years with a precision and an attention she had not fully understood until now. The man she had lived beside had been observing her and knowing her and building toward her in ways that had been invisible to her while they were happening. She does not always say so. He had known. He had always known. She was still sitting at the table when Randolph Fitch came back. She saw him from the window coming up the limestone path with the unhurried pace of a man who has decided to be reasonable and wants that reasonableness to be visible from a distance. He was perhaps 58, the kind of man whose confidence had become indistinguishable from his posture, dressed in the coastal casual manner of someone whose clothing is designed to look effortless. She went to the door before he reached the porch. He stated a number, the same number he had said the day before, then a different number larger. He said he had done additional research and wanted to reflect the updated assessment. He said he understood she was in a difficult situation and wanted to make this straightforward. She thought about the green notebook on the kitchen table. She thought about October 2003 and the sentence about the way she always turns toward water. I'm not selling, she said. His expression did something small and controlled. He mentioned the practical dimensions of property taxes on Dune Ridge Road, the cost of maintaining a historic structure, her situation as someone new to the area without established resources. I have considered them, she said. She was not naive about the numbers. She had sat the night before with a legal pad and gone through them the same methodical way she had always approached what needed to be examined without distortion. The property taxes were significant. Her resources were her Social Security and George's pension. She had written the numbers down and looked at them and had not pretended they were different from what they were. But she had also sat on that porch and looked at the lake and felt what George had intended for her to feel in this place. She had read the green notebook. She understood that what he had built here was not simply a cabin on an island. It was the answer to every weekend away, the accumulation of 32 years of quiet intention. Randolph Fitch was asking her to sell the answer. I'm not selling, she said again. He left his card on the porch railing. She did not pick it up. She went back inside, sat at the table, and pulled the legal pad toward her. Not the losses column this time. The other column. She thought about what Everett had said, the kind of people who would want to own something like this, not to alter it, to live in it exactly as it is. She thought about something else entirely. She thought about the two rocking chairs on the back porch placed side by side facing the water. George had built a place for two people. The second chair was not going to fill itself. She wrote a number at the top of the page. She wrote beneath it a question. She circled the question. Then she called Diane. Diane drove up from Cincinnati on a Friday, taking the ferry across in the late afternoon with the expression she wore when she was preparing to be practical about something she was also afraid of. Ruth recognized it from 45 years of watching her daughter decide to be competent about things that were also breaking her heart a little. She came around the side of the cabin to the back porch and stopped when she saw the view. She stood there without speaking. "Mom," she said finally. "I know," Ruth said. Diane sat in the second rocking chair. She looked at the lake in the October afternoon light, the water going golden gray at the horizon. She ran her hand along the arm of the chair, the way Ruth had done, feeling the surface, reading it. Then she looked at the empty chair beside hers and understood what she was sitting in, and her face changed in the way faces change when something lands that cannot be unlanded. And she was quiet for a moment with her hand still on the arm of the chair George had made and placed here facing the water he had wanted them both to see. "He made two of them," Diane said quietly. "He always made two," Ruth said. They sat together and watched the light change on the lake, and after a while Diane wiped her face once with the back of her hand and straightened in her chair. "All right," she said. "Tell me the plan," Ruth told her. She laid it out the way she had always laid out the things that needed to be decided, the income side and the cost side, and the questions still open. She had spent 4 evenings on the legal pad and 2 phone calls with Sylvia Hartwell, a real estate attorney in Sandusky who had spent 3 decades working with historic properties along the Lake Erie shore, and who Everett Marsh had put her in contact with. Sylvia had been direct in the way of people who have worked in a field long enough to value accuracy over reassurance. The right buyer for a property like this one would pay considerably more than what Fitch had offered. A sale to the right buyer structured correctly could solve the financial problem completely. Ruth had listened and had understood exactly what Sylvia was describing. And then she had told Sylvia about her other idea. Sylvia had been quiet for a moment in the way of someone thinking rather than preparing to speak. Then she had said it could work. It would require specific legal structuring. The zoning on Kelly's Island for short-term accommodations was navigable. The historic designation, if they pursued it formally, would actually support rather than complicate the permitting. The cabin itself, properly assessed and documented, was sufficient collateral to approach a small business lender. It could work. It won't be simple, but it could work. Now Ruth told Diane all of it. The cabin as a historic inn. 5 rooms, the renovation limited to what was necessary, and nothing more, the infrastructure updated, but the character preserved. Everett Marsh had already offered to oversee the preservation aspects at no charge. Sylvia Hartwell had a contractor she trusted who had worked on 3 other historic properties on the island. Diane listened without interrupting. When Ruth finished, Diane was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure?" Diane said. Ruth looked at the lake. "Your father built this for us," she said. "Not for me to sell, for us to be in." She was quiet for a moment. "I can be in it for both of us." Diane nodded slowly. Then she said, "You're going to need help with the business side." "I know," Ruth said. They moved inside to the kitchen table and worked until 10 o'clock, Diane pulling up zoning codes and small business loan requirements and comparable properties. Ruth writing numbers on the legal pad and asking questions and listening to the answers. They ate sandwiches Diane had brought from the mainland and drank tea from the small kettle in the cabin's kitchen. And at some point, the practical work became something else as well. The two of them at a table George had built in a house George had built, figuring out how to build the next part. At 10 o'clock, Diane looked at the numbers on the legal pad and looked at her mother. "I think you can do this," she said. "I know I can," Ruth said. The renovation began in November and took 4 months, which was longer than the contractor had initially said and shorter than Ruth had feared. She stayed in the cabin throughout. She managed the work the way she had managed everything in her life, by understanding what needed to happen and doing it in the correct order, by being present every day, by asking questions and following up when the answers were incomplete. A renovation was not fundamentally different from the domestic management she had practiced for decades. She was good at it. The cabin structure required almost nothing. George had built it to last, and it had lasted. The American chestnut that formed the bones of the building had not moved or shifted or done any of the things that lesser wood does over decades of seasonal change. What the cabin needed was updated plumbing, a heating system suited to Lake Erie winters, a kitchen equipped for genuine use bathrooms added to what had been a single sleeping wing. Everett Marsh came twice a month to review the work. He had written the formal architectural assessment in October, a 12-page document that described the cabin's structural wood, its joinery, its historical significance, and its condition. The document had circulated in the preservation community quickly and with considerable interest. By the time the renovation was half complete, Ruth had received inquiries from preservation organizations and private individuals who had read Everett's assessment. She replied to each of them with the same courtesy and the same answer. The property is not available for sale. It is being developed as a historic accommodation. If you would like to be notified when reservations open, please leave your contact information. 7 of them left their contact information. She added them to the list she was keeping. It was in the 3rd month of the renovation, on a Tuesday afternoon in January, when the island was locked in the gray cold of a Lake Erie winter, that Randolph Fitch came back. Ruth was on the back porch reviewing contractor invoices when she heard the knock at the front door. She went through the cabin and opened it and found him there, more formally dressed than she had seen him before. He had brought a lawyer. The lawyer was a younger man with a briefcase who handed Ruth a business card she did not look at. Fitch was pleasant and precise. He had done additional research on the property. He had discovered what he described as an irregularity in the preservation filing George had submitted in October of 2019. The boundary description in the Historic Preservation Registration did not precisely match the boundary description in the original deed, a discrepancy of approximately 3 feet on the eastern property line. Under Ohio historic preservation statutes, a registration containing a boundary discrepancy could be challenged, and if the discrepancy was not corrected within 30 days of a formal notice of challenge, the registration could be voided. The lawyer handed Ruth an envelope. "Formal notice of challenge," Fitch said. 30 days from today. He was pleasant about it. At the base of the limestone path, he turned and said he hoped she would reconsider his offer, which remained open. Ruth closed the door. She stood in the main room and held the envelope and looked at the American chestnut floor in George's varying width pattern and breathed. Then she called Sylvia Hartwell. Sylvia was quiet while Ruth explained. Then she said, "Send me the envelope, the deed, and all of the preservation registration documents." "Send them tonight." Ruth scanned and sent everything. Then she sat at the kitchen table and wrote down what she knew and what she did not know and what she needed to find out, the same way she had always approached the things that needed to be solved. She did not stop the renovation. She did not tell the contractor to pause. She ordered the kitchen fittings she had been waiting on and confirmed the delivery dates and continued the work of turning George's cabin into what she had decided it was going to be, because stopping was not something she was prepared to do. Sylvia called back on a Thursday. "I've read everything," she said. She paused in the particular way Ruth had come to recognize the pause before precise information. "I need to ask you something first. Did your husband ever discuss the preservation filing with you?" "No," Ruth said. "He filed it in October 2019, 3 years before he died. He didn't tell me about it. He didn't tell me about any of this." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I think you need to sit down for this." Ruth was already sitting. "The discrepancy in the boundary description is real," Sylvia said. 3 feet on the eastern line, exactly as Fitch's lawyer described it. but I've spent 2 days going through the original filing documentation, and I want you to understand something. Your husband was meticulous. I've worked with preservation filings for 30 years, and I have rarely seen documentation as thorough as what he submitted. The property records are complete. The architectural documentation is complete. The sourcing records for the building materials are complete. A man that careful does not make a 3-foot error in a boundary description. Ruth waited. Under Ohio preservation statutes, Sylvia continued, there is a provision that allows the legal heir of a registered historic property to amend boundary descriptions within the registration without a court proceeding. The amendment can be filed directly with the Ohio Historic Preservation Office by the inheriting party. The provision applies within 5 years of the original owner's death. Ruth said nothing. George filed the registration in October 2019, Sylvia said. He died in February 2023. You are the inheriting party. The 5-year window is open until February 2028. The amendment process requires your signature and a corrected survey, which I can have completed within the week. Fitch's challenge becomes moot the moment the amendment is filed because the challenge is predicated on the discrepancy, and the discrepancy ceases to exist once you file. Ruth held the phone. He left it open on purpose, she said. It was not a question. I believe so. Yes, Sylvia said. The irregularity is too specific and too singular in an otherwise flawless document. He left one door open, a door that only you could walk through. Ruth looked at the American chestnut floor. She looked at the January lake beyond the window, gray and still and enormous. She thought about George in October of 2019 coming to this island for what he must have known was likely his last time here, with full strength, sitting in one of the rocking chairs he had made, looking at this water, filing the preservation registration and leaving a single specific intentional gap. A gap shaped exactly like her. He had taken the house on Briarwood Lane by deciding for her. He was returning something by deciding for her one final time. But this time the decision he was making for her was the decision to let her decide. He had left her the one action he could not take himself. He had made the thing he was protecting require her hand to complete the protection. He had given back what he had taken in the only form it was his to give. File it, Ruth said. The amendment was filed on a Tuesday morning in January, 19 days after Fitch's formal challenge. The correction was processed by the Ohio Historic Preservation Office within 72 hours. The historic registration of the Callaway cabin on Kelly's Island became unassailable on a Friday afternoon in the last week of January, and Randolph Fitch's challenge became moot. Sylvia sent Ruth a message when the processing was confirmed. One line, it's done, the cabin is protected. Ruth was standing on the back porch when the message arrived. January on Lake Erie, the water dark and heaving at the horizon, the sky the color of cold iron. She read the message and stood there for a while looking at the water. You left me one thing to do, she thought. You made sure it was mine to do. She put her phone in her pocket and went back inside to finish preparing the rooms. The Callaway's Cove Historic Inn opened on the second Saturday of April on a morning that was clear and cold and bright, with the particular hard light of a Great Lakes spring, the kind of light that makes everything look new, because it is showing you the edges of things you stopped seeing when they became familiar. The lake was the deep blue it turned in April, a color it held for only a few weeks before the warming water softened it into the gentler blues and greens of summer. Ruth had named the 5 rooms for the woods George had used: chestnut, white oak, walnut, elm, pine. Each room had a small card on the dresser explaining the wood in the room's name, where the species had grown, what had happened to it, how George had come to use it here. Everett Marsh had written the text for the cards precise and clear, and without sentimentality, letting the facts carry the weight because the facts were sufficient. The first guest arrived at 2 in the afternoon, a retired couple from Cleveland who had found the listing through a preservation architecture newsletter that had run a short piece on Everett's assessment. They were in their late 60s, quiet and observant, the kind of guests who touch the surfaces of old buildings with the attention of people who understand what they are touching. The man spent 20 minutes in the main room, running his hand along the chestnut shelves before he said anything to Ruth. And when he spoke, it was to ask about the joinery, the specific technique George had used in the shelf brackets. And she found she could answer him because she had spent 4 months living with these shelves and had asked Everett the same question and had written the answer down. George would have liked this man, she thought. By the end of April, the calendar was filling. By June, it was full through October. The guests who came were not only the tourists who came to Kelly's Island for the wineries and the glacial grooves. The guests who came first and most consistently were people who had found the property through the preservation community, through Everett's assessment, through word of mouth, in the specific circles where people care about old buildings and old wood and the things that cannot be made again. They were in general people who paid attention, people who touched things carefully, people who understood without being told that they were staying somewhere that had been built with intention over a very long time. Ruth made breakfast each morning and sat with the guests when they wanted company and left them alone when they did not. She learned over the course of that first summer the rhythms of hospitality that she had not known before, but that turned out to require the same qualities as running a household: the attention to detail, the management of small systems, the willingness to solve problems before they became visible to the people who should not have to see them. On a Tuesday in late May, Randolph Fitch drove slowly past the property in a dark car. He did not stop. He did not turn into the drive. Ruth watched him from the front porch with her coffee and waited until the car had continued down Dune Ridge Road, and then she went back inside to prepare the rooms for the arriving guests. She did not think about him again that day. On a Friday evening in the last week of October, the final guests of the season checked out after breakfast, and Ruth stood at the front door and watched their car go down the limestone path and turn onto Dune Ridge Road and disappear. The season was over. The island had taken on its autumn self, the summer population gone, the roads quiet, the light low and specific over the water. She made tea and carried it to the back porch. She sat in her rocking chair. The lake in late October was the dark pewter blue of the deep season, the color it held from October through the first ice. The last of the afternoon light was on the far shore, faint and horizontal, the light of a sun that had moved south and was spending less time on this part of the world. A great blue heron moved along the base of the ridge, below the porch, unhurried with the ancient assurance of a creature that has been doing exactly this for longer than anyone watching it has been alive. Ruth watched it until it rounded the far end of the ridge and was gone. She held the key with the shell. She had held it this way many evenings over the course of the year, in the evenings when the day had settled into something she could sit inside. The shell was small and smooth and white, worn by the lake into something simple. George had picked it up on this shore. She was certain of that without being able to prove it. He had put it on the key because it was from the place the key belonged to, because he was a man who thought about how things fit together and made them fit correctly, even the small things. She thought about the green notebook on the shelf inside the careful technical records, and the lines scattered through the years that were not technical at all. She thought about October 2003 in a sentence about the way she turned toward water. She had been 48 years old that October, living her life in Dayton, without knowing that 250 miles north, her husband was sitting on this porch after a day of work and writing a sentence about her in a notebook she would not read for 20 years. She thought about February 2019 and his note about deciding to wait until spring, about wanting it to be right when she finally saw it. He had never gotten to spring. The spring had come without him, and the spring after that, and this spring, when she had opened the doors of Callaway's Cove and stood on the front porch and watched the first guests come up the limestone path. She had felt something she had not been able to name at the time, and could only name now, sitting in the October evening with the key in her hand and the lake going dark before her. It was the feeling of arriving somewhere. Not the arriving she had done in September of the year before, stepping off the ferry with 2 suitcases and a portrait, and a key she had found in a broken frame. That had been a different kind of the arriving of someone who does not know what they are arriving at. This was the other kind, the arriving of someone who has done the work and earned the place and understands looking at it that it is theirs. Not because anyone gave it to them, because they built it. George had built the cabin, she had built the rest. The door behind her opened the particular sound of old chestnut fitting precisely into an old chestnut frame, the solidity of wood that had been chosen carefully and fitted by a man who did not know how to do things any other way. The couple from the chestnut room here for a long weekend before the season fully closed came out onto the porch with the quiet of people who could see she was sitting with something and did not want to interrupt it. She moved slightly and indicated the chairs at the porch railing, and they took them and looked at the lake. The three of them sat for a while without speaking, watching the last light go off the water. This was one of the things she had learned about the porch and the view. It produced a quality of shared quiet that made conversation unnecessary. People sat here and looked at the lake, and whatever they had brought with them from their ordinary lives receded to the correct proportion. "Your husband built this place," the woman asked after a while. Ruth looked at the lake. "He built the cabin," she said. "I built the rest." The woman nodded as though this was a complete answer. Because it was. The last light was gone. The lake went dark. The Canadian shore disappeared into the night. The island had gone quiet in the way it went quiet in October, the deep, self-contained quiet of a small place that has seen many seasons and does not require an audience for any of them. Ruth held the shell key in her palm. The weight of it was almost nothing. It was also the weight of 32 years of weekends in a green notebook, in a floor laid in the pattern of home, and a mat that said home placed on a porch by a man who was already sick, who had driven here anyway, who had knelt down and placed it there for the woman who would come after. Everything else had been taken. She had been that woman. She had come. She had found what he left her, and she had fought for it, and she had built something from it that would last. The season was over. The next one would come.